Well, for our COBT listeners and viewers, it's Maynard, Mike, and Brett with a great guest, a VIP guest, and something that really couldn't be more timely given the weather that's going on across the country. We're here with Chairman Thomas Gleeson of the Public Utility Commission of Texas. As you'll hear in his background, he's been with the Public Utility Commission for 16 plus years. He's now the chairman. Texas, I think, in so many ways is the center of the power revolution that's happening in the world. We need more power. We're incorporating all sources. We've got huge demands coming that the chairman and the Public Utility Commission and everyone in Austin is trying to keep up with. So doing it on a day when there's a lot of strain in the system, like there always is when we have either super hot or super cold. I'll stop talking now. Chairman Gleeson, thank you so much for joining us.
Maynard, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. I listen to your podcast. I think I've even told you before that after one of your podcasts, I've reached out to the person you had to talk through some issues with them. So I find it very informative, and I'm honored to be on.
Well, it's super fun for us. I think we're all seriously trying to understand all these dynamics of power, and you're in the center of it. So we're just delighted to have you. Mike is joining us. Interestingly enough, I think most of our friends know Mike grew up in Panama, finished high school in Panama, occasionally goes to Panama. But Mike, you must have been forward positioned just to give us the color on President-elect Trump's views of the canal.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Maynard. I'll give you a little brief synopsis of that. And I think most people, when they heard that Trump was looking to take back the canal, they were generally in shock. And I said, whoa, that's just the way he deals with things right now. And then obviously when he was the inauguration, when he mentioned it again, people were like, is he really serious? What's going on here? And some of the stuff that I hear from guys that are in the know, that know the president of Panama, was kind of taken aback by this. And a lot of people that looked at the new U.S. ambassador to Panama were like, who is this guy? So it really is a fluid situation right now, especially from the Panamanians' point of view. So we look forward to basically continuing to talk to some of our friends down there, and hopefully we'll do a Panama Canal episode here and not to too distant future, and maybe I'll be able to come back down. But well, that's, yeah.
As you know, Mike, that was Dan Jurgen's suggestion just last week. He said, I love the Greenland show. You guys need a Panama Canal show. We'll take him up on that.
Looking forward to it.
I know earnings season has started in earnest. What would you tell us about the markets or anything else before we jump in with Chairman Gleeson?
Yeah, all I'd say is, look, obviously yesterday was the inauguration. First day, what are markets doing? I mean, you have the stock markets up, the Dow's up around 450, 500 points. I just think a lot of the reason it's up today is because this aggressive tariff policy that he initially was going to lay out hasn't happened. So I think the markets are rallying on that. Crude oil is down $1.50 to $2 today. And I think a lot of that is because it seems like a lot of his policies are meant to push prices lower. So I think the market's reacting to that. And the dollar is actually moving up pretty hard today. And so that's really affecting a lot of commodity prices. And so from the standpoint of just earnings for energy right now, we'll try to keep it brief, is last week SLB reported earnings. Pretty good report. Stock was up 7 or 8%. The whole group rally. And it wasn't surprising what they said about, both domestic and international spending. It's going to be pretty conservative for most companies. I think the reason that stock rallied is they did an accelerated stock repurchase program around $2.3 billion. That took a lot of people by surprise. It's saying that, hey, we know the environment over the next 6-12 months might be a little bit shaky, a little bit rocky. And guess what? We're going to buy our stock back, and we're going to do it aggressively. And so the group rallied. So that's what I'd say. Kinder Morgan reports later on Wednesday, I believe it is. And we have a couple other service companies. Halliburton, I believe, is going to be reporting on Wednesday as well. So we're going to hear a lot about what spending is going to look like from both an oil major and E&P standpoint in the next 24 to 48 hours. And it generally seems like it's going to be muted to conservative. So I don't think that's going to surprise anybody. I think the issue for these companies is, what are they going to do with their excess free cash flow? That's what the market's looking at right now.
All right. Well, there'll be lots more to come when it comes to earnings. Brett Rampal is going to join us for the conversation here today. So, Brett, I know you've got a lot of nuclear things on your mind as we go into that conversation. Anything you'd highlight up front?
Yeah, well, I think it's been a very interesting couple of weeks as we start the transition into a new administration, and excuse me, I should say couple of months, and both of the past administration and the incoming administration try to reaffirm their commitment and their long-standing support for nuclear energy and nuclear energy technologies. We saw 1, 2, 3 agreements signed in December under the Biden administration with Singapore, agreements around cooperation with Korea, and a an agreement that we've been waiting for a long time, finally, between Korean reactor developers and Westinghouse to kind of release some IP challenges and open up a world of export possibilities. So these sort of outside the U.S. sort of drivers, as well as the sort of prominent position of nuclear energy and many of the executive orders and sort of statements being made by the new administration in the last couple of days, coupled together to create a very interesting position to kind of re-review where we're at, but also have a little bit of certainty that we're probably going to be going back into a chute of supporting nuclear and looking at exports and trying to pave the way for real change in this area over the next 4 years, just as we saw it over the last 4 years. So it's just really interesting. It tends to be, a conversation point that's very different and bipartisan versus everything right now. And it's really cool, in my opinion, to not have to scour executive orders for nuclear and to see it featured in lots of places.
Well, it is one of those areas, Chairman Gleeson, this has come up in talking to you. Nuclear is a place which gets curiosity and support from both sides of the aisle. As we jump in with you and think about your career, you have seen so much at the Public Utility Commission. Now you're chairman. How do you think about when you took this job? I guess it's been about a year ago. How do you think about your main goals? You've been a part of it for so long. Like as you took on the role, how did you see kind of the key things that you wanted to accomplish as chairman?
Yeah, Maynard, the job I took is very different from the job my predecessor, Peter Lake, took. When he came on, we were in a crisis. The 3 sitting commissioners, 2 of them had been asked to resign. One resigned of their own volition. And so he really came on to steady the ship and try to figure out what we needed to do very quickly in order to stabilize the market and the grid. That's a very different job from the one I stepped into a little over a year ago. My job, as I see it, and in speaking with the governor, was primarily to try to calm everything after the initial move to change the market was done. So what I've really focused on is meeting with all market participants. I've given over 50 speeches and talks. I haven't turned down a single meeting with any stakeholder. My goal in that was really to have the PUC and the ERCOT process be the venues at which a lot of the policy discussions were happening, hopeful that we could move those discussions away from the legislature when appropriate, because everyone felt that they were getting a fair shake and had a voice at the commission and through the ERCOT process. And I think as we've now begun the 89th legislature, I think we've gone a long way to trying to accomplish that. Of course, the legislature will speak on a number of issues, but my hope is that contrary to what we've seen the last 2 legislative sessions, hopefully the legislation that is enacted will be less prescriptive and more directional in nature and allow the details to be worked out through the commission and ERCOT.
Maybe, Chairman Gleeson, if you don't mind, and of course, from your perspective, the relationship between the PUC and ERCOT is an interesting one, and I think a lot of our viewers and listeners understand it, but it has some complexity, and so maybe you wouldn't mind sharing your thoughts on it.
Sure. So statutorily, the PUC has complete authority over ERCOT. In practice, that's not how it actually works, of course. They have a control room and operators that minute by minute are operating the supply and demand of the grid. We're not sitting there, telling them what to do. That's their job. Really, the relationship is one where we work collaboratively on policy issues with ERCOT. And then after the 2021 session, the biggest change is any new protocol or rule enacted by ERCOT has to come to the commission for the commission to approve. So what that does is it really creates a backstop at the commission where if any stakeholders feel like any issue wasn't fully vetted as it moved through the ERCOT process and ultimately gets adopted by their board, that there's one more check on that policy before it becomes fully enacted at the commission. But I would say day in and day out, we work collaboratively with ERCOT, to jointly ensure that there's enough power on the grid and, all citizens and businesses in the state are getting resilient, reliable power.
Well, and this is really just a nuts and bolts question, but you mentioned all the changes that took place after Uri that Peter Lake was a part of. Do you mind just talking about the composition of the PUC, who's on it now, how it changes through time? Like, how should people think about how we get people to serve in those roles and where we find them?
Sure. So prior to the 2021 session, historically since 1975, the commission was always comprised of 3 members. So coming out of Winter Storm Uri, one of the issues that the legislature noticed was that because there are only 3, they could not talk during the crisis. So what you heard come out in the some 25 hours of testimony during the 2021 session following the storm was that there was a lot of duplicative work going on. So there were a number of ways that you could have tried to remedy that issue. You could have allowed the commissioners to talk during declared emergencies. But what the legislature ultimately decided to do was to add 2 members to the commission. So now we can seat 5. And that allows us to be able to talk, particularly in times of emergency, to ensure that everyone is doing a singular job, that there's no duplicative effort going on, and then we're really covering all of our bases. So we haven't always had 5 since then. In fact, it was just a very short time, maybe around a year, that we actually have had 5 seated. And then in December, 2 of my colleagues at the time, Commissioner Lori Kobos and Commissioner Jimmy Glotfelty, both announced that they'd be departing the commission on December 31st. So right now, going into this legislative session, again, we have 3 commissioners, myself, then Kathleen Jackson, who's been on the commission for a couple of years now and came over from the Water Development Board, where she was a commissioner for a number of years. And then Courtney Yaltman, she's an attorney who worked in the governor's office, and then directly preceding her time as a commissioner, she served as the counsel at the Office of Public Utility Counsel. That's another gubernatorial appointment. And what OPUCT does is they represent small and commercial users of electricity, mostly in contested case matters and projects and rules that go on at the commission.
And when you say you had 3, you couldn't talk, like what do you mean exactly by that?
Sure. So one of the reasons that most commissions and boards have 3 members is because due to open meetings law, you cannot talk if you have a quorum. So with having 3, any 2 members talking constitutes a quorum, and that's illegal. So during that storm, even if it was not an issue that anyone would have had any concern about commissioners discussing, it was illegal for them to talk. By going to 5, for instance, now going into a storm when we have 5 members on the commission, I can talk to each of them individually about different things to ensure that all the work that needs to get done at the commission level is getting done. Of course, with there only being 3 of us again, that becomes a little more difficult, and it really falls then to the commission's executive director to talk to each of us and know what we're each doing so that she can then pass that along to the other commissioners to ensure that all the work's getting done. Wow,
that's interesting. It's a unique feature of how laws affect management. I guess when you think about Winter Storm Uri, kind of one of the biggest, and certainly in Texas power history and in the nation, that really just was such a jarring and terrible thing. Where are we today in terms of, like, we are experiencing a lot of cold across the country, across Texas? We've got snow. Like, how would you say the system is performing? What are you picking up on and gleaning from this test we're going through right now?
Yeah, so the ERCOT grid is performing exceptionally well. If you look at resource outages across the board, there are actually fewer resource outages than ERCOT predicts for this time of year seasonally. And so, that's just one metric of performance, but I think it's an important metric, and we're performing extremely well. I think that's a testament to the laws that the legislature passed coming out of 2021, and those that the governor signed, and all the work that the market participants, that the ERCOT staff and ERCOT board and commission staff have done, particularly on weatherization efforts of all the critical infrastructure to ensure that we never have a situation like Uri again. And I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention all the work that's been done on the natural gas side by the Railroad Commission and all the gas producers and providers to winterize and weatherize their system to ensure that all of our thermal gas fleet plants get the gas they need to provide electricity to the entire system. So it's really been across the board, I think, since Uri, a story of success from all the different components that have interplayed to ensure that we have a reliable grid.
And when you say the resources online, you mean all flavors, and you're also inclusive of anything that might be in maintenance or anything like that?
That's right. So if you look at our gas fleet, our renewable fleet, meaning wind and solar, you look at our storage fleet, nuclear, everything is performing better at what would be expected or better. And so, we couldn't ask for better outcomes than that. While again, this storm didn't have nearly the severity of Winter Storm Uri. It is a test, and it puts stress on the grid, both the generation resources and the transmission distribution, the wires and poles infrastructure, and it's all performing exceptionally well. There are some localized outages where we've seen mostly distribution resources go down, which happens when there's ice accumulation and wind. But those resources, those wires and poles, are being fixed quickly. And at this point, we do not have an abundant number of customers without power on the ERCOT grid.
Do you have a sense of just how much power we're using right now?
Yeah. So if you think about in the summer, we typically hit a peak of around, 85, 87 gigs. ERCOT yesterday hit about 75,000 gigs, and they're predicting a little higher usage today and tomorrow. So I anticipate if you look at peak load, when we do a backcast of this, you'll see a peak of somewhere around 77, 78,000 megawatts of load on the system.
And is that about the amount of the dispatchable power on the system, or that's a little more?
It's a little more than what we get in the winter. So you have to remember, in the winter, a number of the thermal resources are derated a little bit. So it's actually more, which is why, again, it's good to have all the resources online that we do. In a lot of the country, Maynard, when I give talks across the country, I hear a lot of regulators and a lot of folks in this space talking about an energy transition. But I can tell you, in Texas, as the chief regulator here, I don't have the luxury of trading one resource for another. We're in the midst of an energy expansion in Texas. And that means that every resource, from wind to solar to storage to nuclear to gas to coal, we need all of those resources in abundance. And those are the policies that we try to put in place in the state.
It's such an interesting point, because I think it would be easy, whether it's because we live in Texas or just looking at the national headlines, you would think the whole country was experiencing a massive surge in demand for power. But that's not the case. It's in some places, but in other places it's slower, and in some places it's even declining. Can you give us a feel, because you are talking to so many people all across the country, can you give us a feel for some of those impressions or conversations?
Yeah, that's exactly right. If you look at most of the country, you're seeing demand on their systems either marginally increasing or stagnating or even declining, like you said. Here, that is not the case. ERCOT put out a projection about 6 months ago that showed that their projection has demand in this state increasing from, let's say, between 85 and 90 gigs of demand in the summer to somewhere around 150 gigs of demand by 2030. Now, I will say, I don't know that all of that demand is actually going to come to the state. But even if you see an increase over the next 5 to 7 years of, 50% of that coming, you're still going to see a massive, massive increase, larger than anything anyone could have predicted 10 years ago, coming to this state. And that's really a testament to the environment that we have here. We are blessed in this state with abundant natural resources. We're blessed with great state leadership. The governor and lieutenant governor and speaker of this state are very pro-business and help us to enact laws and policies, regulations that incent businesses and people to come to this state. But there's a trade-off with that. When you have all of these businesses and folks coming to the state, it's incumbent on you to then invest in that infrastructure. You have to invest in fiber and telecommunications. You have to invest in water. You have to invest in roads, and you have to invest in electricity. And so that's what we're aiming to do. I believe that we've got the right structure in place to meet that growing demand, and we'll meet it head on, and we'll have enough power to power the state for years to come.
I think this is something that's come up on a lot of the previous COBTs, which is we talk about industry, choosing where it's going to locate. And, let's just take a big picture. We can start with the Western world, and then you start working your way through the various issues, labor laws, contract law, power, land. And Texas does stick out, which is highly competitive in all those things. Is it often the case that you get somebody coming by the office saying, hey, I'm thinking of putting my industrial facility somewhere in Texas, and I want to talk to you about what power is going to look like? Is that a typical conversation you might have?
Yes, it happens all the time. Right after the winter storm, a lot of those conversations focused on, can you ensure that we're going to have reliable power? And I think history has proven over the last 4 years that the power supply in this state is reliable. Now, the conversations I have are around how quickly can we energize? Speed to market, speed to power has really been the pivot point that is making businesses come and locate here. And we do everything we can from a regulatory framework to ensure that we check all the boxes and ensure that any company that's coming here that needs power, that it's being done in a managed way. But we don't have hurdles in place just for the sake of having companies jump through those hoops. We try to get them on the grid as quickly as possible so that they can bring those jobs and that economic development to the state. And like I said, that's really a testament to the elected leadership of this state, because we get our cues from them, and that is the mandate that they've given us. And we take it to heart. And like I said, we do what we feel we need to from a regulatory standpoint to ensure that there will be good corporate citizens, but we don't put extra hurdles in the way that they have to jump over. We want them to bring those jobs and that economic development here as quickly as they can.
It's interesting. You're, I don't know if I have the right analogy, but you're a little bit like the lifeguard at the pool, or, you're watching over all this and trying to, recommend changes as needed, to make sure we have the adequate power we want. But how do all this growth really presents a challenge, right? To get more power, and also to get the power in the portfolio that you'd like, so that it has the performance characteristics that you like. And then there's obviously been some attention in Texas around trying to get more natural gas or more dispatchable power. Like, what's your latest thinking on influencing the growth in the way you want to do it while staying sort of hands off and pro market?
Yeah, I mean, that's right. At our core, the PUC is an economic regulator. And so a lot of our charge is looking at the real world, what's happening, and think about what are we trying to solve for, and do we have the right economic incentives in place to drive the outcomes that we're looking to achieve. And so you're right. Right now, when I talk to folks and I look at the ERCOT interconnection queue for generation resources, we don't have an issue with incentives for, say, battery storage or for solar. We do seem to have an incentive issue with thermal dispatchable generation, talking mostly about gas-fired generation, both peaking units and combined cycle baseload units. And so a a lot of the work we do on the market side at the commission is trying to answer that question of how do we provide the proper incentives to get those outcomes we're looking for, which in this case would be additional thermal gas-fired generation. So when you listen to our commission meetings or you listen to an ERCOT board meeting, that's where a lot of the discussion lies. And so what I try to do, particularly given the time that we're talking now during a legislative session, is lend my experience and expertise to the members of the legislature and the governor about here's what I'm seeing. I think we may need to make some changes. Here's how I think we can do that. One of the things that we're talking about right now is looking at a new ancillary service that would be focused just on dispatchable thermal resources. The legislature last session, in one of the laws they passed, created dispatchable reliability reserve service. And it was left pretty open what resources that could go to. What the statute actually had were performance requirements. So the policy discussion that's occurring right now at ERCOT and at the PUC is, should those revenues be authorized to go to, say, battery storage if it can meet the required attributes? I can tell you my feeling right now is, like I said, I don't have an incentive problem for battery storage. So at least in the kind of first iteration of that product, my goal is to have those revenues that are generated from that new service focused directly on thermal dispatchable units to hopefully provide those revenues to those companies building those types of units, to have them come commit their capital in the state and build that gas-fired generation in the state.
Chairman Gleeson, thanks for joining us. We were talking earlier about just how well the grid is held up here during the storm. Now, it's not over yet, but it's held up relatively well. And I'd say if I was an industrial customer who was looking to move to Texas, I would be worrying about what happened in Uri and now seeing what's happening here, saying, you know what, I think these guys have got it. My incentive to move here is really probably accelerated, to be quite honest with you. I guess my question is, talking about going from 85,000 megawatts to 120, 130,000 megawatts, that's easy to say, but much more difficult to do. And I guess my question is for you is, what does that mean for pricing? What does that mean just for everybody involved in trying to get us there? Are we all rowing in the same direction? What kind of culture needs to be there to basically go from a stable type growth to just accelerate growth over the next 5 or 6 years? I mean, is the culture there? How do you think things have changed over the last 3 or 4 years? And do you think the culture is there to kind of take us for the next 5 or 6 years?
Yeah, no, I definitely think the culture's there, Mike, and thank you for that question. Coming out of Winter Storm Uri, I would say if you think of a pendulum, a trade-off between, say, reliability and costs. Prior to Winter Storm Uri, I think we were focused very heavily on costs. We wanted to have the lowest cost energy, and I think there's a lot of value in that. I think post Winter Storm Uri, that pendulum swang the other direction, and it was almost reliability at any cost, because we had to reinstill an understanding from the public and confidence in the public that we could manage the grid. I think that pendulum has started to swing back the other way, to where there really needs to be a trade-off discussion between cost and reliability. And I think we can achieve both. I think you're 100% right. Industrial customers for the last couple of years were talking to us, can you ensure that we will get reliable electricity? A lot of these industrial facilities need 24/7 by 365 consistent, reliable power. And that's number one to them. Those conversations have started to pivot back the other way. Costs have risen here. And those companies want to know that we have an eye towards costs, and we're looking to, yes, provide a reliable grid, but not at a cost more than is necessary to provide the reliability that we're looking to achieve. So those conversations are going on. One of the ways I think about looking at that is having a ton of stakeholder engagement. One of the things that we've tried, and I have tried over the last year being the chairman of this commission, is listening to every stakeholder, because I really think that's how the best policy gets formulated. When you take everybody's opinion, everyone's view with their own self-interest, and then try to come up with, okay, out of all that, what is the best public policy? What is in the public interest for the state to adopt? And I think we've done that. As this load is coming on, it has to be done in a managed way. We want all these businesses to come to the state. The state is open for business, but we cannot risk reliability as we're bringing on all that load. And so we've talked to a lot of the large loads that plan to locate here about their timelines, about ways that they can be good corporate citizens, whether that's coming and bringing their own generation with them. If they're planning to co-locate with an existing generation unit, a number of those companies have said, while we'll be taking energy, electricity off the existing grid, we're going to partner with that generator and help them build additional capacity on the grid to serve the larger bulk power system. And so those are great conversations to have. Everyone, I think, is bought in that we're going to either succeed or fail together. And to your point, everyone is rowing in the same direction, that we need to achieve positive outcomes for everyone together, and that's ensuring reliability at a reasonable cost. And I think we are on our way to attaining that. And I have a very positive outlook in ensuring that we'll keep a climate here of wanting businesses and citizens to come here from other states and providing the right atmosphere for them to do so.
Chairman, thanks so much again for spending some time with us and chatting with us. I know we touched on this a little bit about the conversations you have with sort of your counterparts in the state regulatory world, but I'm just curious. The regulatory job that you have sometimes is very different than the one that many other public utility commissioners have around the country. Different capabilities, different options, just different, right? I'm curious if there's things that you are normally always saying to your counterparts, hey, why haven't you guys advocated for this more? Why haven't you adopted this yet? Or if there's things that you are constantly seeing in the capabilities in other states that you wish would move more quickly into Texas.
Yeah. So, the conversation I tend to have the most is around why it takes so long for revisions to rules and things to be done in other jurisdictions. So, coming out of Winter Storm Uri, a lot of the discussion was to, should we, quote unquote, interconnect with the US grid, which of course there is no US grid, but understanding the sentiment is ERCOT is an island unto itself. We don't, give or take power from the other systems except for a handful of megawatts that are on DC ties. And what I really learned, prior to being the chairman, I was the executive director of the commission. And what I really learned through that process was a lot of the weatherization efforts that we undertook at the commission were done before the federal jurisdiction even put out a report concerning what recommendations they would give to the rest of the country. And in fact, they used a lot of the changes that we put into place and as a model for what to do throughout the rest of the country. And so, I think sometimes it can be seen as a positive and a negative, but I would argue that on balance, being an island and having our commission be the sole authority in the ERCOT region is actually extremely beneficial, because we can see the reality on the ground and work to find solutions to any issues extremely quickly. We're very nimble as a regulatory body in enacting changes, and that's just not something you see in the rest of the country. The difference, though, is when I do talk to my counterparts, a lot of what they see doesn't really pertain to Texas. It's interesting when we go to kind of national conferences, a lot of my discussions with other regulatory entities really focuses on our work we do on water and telecommunications, and not so much on electricity, because the ERCOT oversight that the PUC does is so different from, like you said, the job that other regulators do at other commissions and boards throughout the country. And so it's definitely can be challenging, because we can't really rely on the experiences of other jurisdictions as much as you would like. But it's also nice, because when we do see issues that need to be addressed, we can work quickly to address them and not have to work for a federal organization to tell us what we need to do.
Do you think, Chairman Gleeson, there's obviously we're doing this on a day when there's a energy order, an emergency coming out of Washington to make changes. Is the federal influence, maybe help us think about the spirit of those, it does seem like the federal influence sometimes is it can be helpful, but it can really slow things down. And when you let states go do their thing, you can get great results. Now you can also get states doing things that are really creating other problems. But how do you think about what we're going to see with the new administration in terms of the federal government being perhaps more useful or more constructive in the way in which it engages with states?
Yeah, so I think it is helpful for us to be able to be nimble generally. Where I think of our interaction with the federal government mostly, and I'm hopeful with this new administration coming in, is around emission standards. With all of the new demand coming on the grid and talking about bringing it on in a managed way, I think a lot of those discussions will kind of center around, as those, let's just say a hyperscaler, a data center comes here that wants to bring on an additional 1,000 megawatts of load, they may be incented to bring backup power with them. And say if the grid got into an emergency situation, they could quickly switch to backup power, and all of that 1,000 megawatts of capacity could then go to the rest of the bulk power system. Well, that backup power they're going to bring in a lot of cases is going to be diesel generation. So if you have a lot of these hyperscalers, just for instance, locate in what are non-attainment areas where emissions are too high and thus there's a restriction, you may see an entity have to make a decision between, do we help out the bulk power system and help ensure reliability? And in doing so, are we making a trade-off and now perhaps going to get fined by the federal government, by the EPA, for doing what we think is the right thing to ensure reliability? So one of the things I've been thinking about, and one of the areas we'll be engaging with the new Trump administration, is, can there be a lessening of those restrictions and those federal rules on emissions to say, look, if you're using backup generation for some period of time, let's just call it 12 hours, because the grid is in an emergency, then you'll get an exemption from those emission standard requirements. Because I think everyone understands that while we can all be in favor of clean air, and I don't think anyone would argue that, there are going to be acute circumstances perhaps where in that kind of trade-off, we're going to choose reliability over, environmental concerns for that period of time, and letting those companies know that they won't, on the back end, after doing what they think is the right thing to do, face some draconian financial administrative penalty, I think would go a long way in helping us ensure reliability on the grid as we're facing this increasing demand. So that's just one example where I think with the incoming administration, we'll work a lot more collaboratively with us and with our stakeholder partners to ensure reliability on the grid.
One question for you, and maybe this is sort of a public perception type question, but one way to see that the sort of the data center community, if you will, or the people who are coming to your state with big power needs is they're going to show up, and it's kind of like you're going to the buffet and you look up and a really big guy is standing there, is going to go to the buffet, and you're like, oh geez, this guy's going to take some of my food. That would be one way to see them. Is another way to see them is these big power consumers, when they come to your state, they're going to help you finance more power. And so their business is not just good for jobs, but it's also good for funding more power infrastructure. And it's therefore a good thing. Or are those two descriptions just too simplistic?
No, I think that's a great way to think about this. So if you see a company, let's just take, let's say Amazon Web Services as an example. If they're coming and they're going to interconnect with the grid, say in front of a power meter, and take energy from the bulk power system, one way to look at that is that's just a price signal. That additional load that needs to be served is going to send a price signal to the market that more generation needs to be built. And as we've previously discussed, we're in an environment right now where we need more gas-fired thermal generation. So that's a positive there. On the other side of that, if an Amazon Web Services, a Google, a Meta is going to come here and contract directly with a generator for energy, that's a positive too, because it gives that generator an additional revenue source. But the other thing that those large hyperscalers are doing, you all know, those companies have the healthiest balance sheets of any companies that have ever existed in all of human history. And so my experience has been in my discussions with them, they are coming to the table as good corporate citizens and willing to work with our generating community to build additional capacity along with them, to give them money to partner with them to build additional capacity for the rest of the state. And so solutions like that are what we really look for in Texas, where the regulator isn't the one coming up with them, the government isn't coming up with them. That's the market itself, the generator, the customer, coming up with solutions to these issues that are facing us now and into tomorrow. And I really believe that's the way these things should be done. Allow those businesses and companies to figure out solutions to the problems that we've given voice to and let them come up with creative solutions to them. And I think we've seen that happen in Texas.
So one question for you. This has come up in our travels and discussions, and because you mentioned stimulating gas plant construction. And this will be really simplistic, so I apologize ahead of time. But ideally, if you're going to build one, build a big one so it's more efficient than a small one. That's one thought. And then, but the economics of building one of these things, you're looking out at the forward curve for power prices, and you're thinking about the cost of the power plant and trying to justify the investment. And I keep hearing that forward curve, it may or may not be correct, but I keep hearing that forward curve doesn't seem to justify building a big one, maybe a small one. But what can you tell us about, because you care about more of these plants being built, what can you tell us about the decision to build one of those, and what are the key variables?
Yeah, so I think there's really two things. One, it's the sufficiency of the revenue, so how much revenue is in the market. But the second piece of that is the stability of those revenues. So if you look back from, say, 2020 through definitely 2023, if you look back at the revenues in the market for those years, there was sufficient revenue based on the cost of new entry, the cost to build a new plant. There were sufficient revenues in the market to incent that build. But what wasn't there was a belief that there would be revenue stability going forward. And so one of the variables we're trying to solve for at the commission, and I would say market participants, is what are ways, if we believe there is enough revenue in the market today, what are ways that we can direct that revenue to the proper resources to make sure we have the right revenue, the right resource mix between intermittents, base load, peaking units, all of the different variables. And so that's one of the challenges at the commission, is to ensure not just revenue sufficiency, but also stability. And as we look to create new services in the ERCOT market to drive additional revenues, those are the questions that we're definitely asking. How do we help those generators that want to invest in the state get the revenue stability they're looking for so they can make an investment that they're going to recover and earn a reasonable return on over the next 20, 30, 40 years. But no, it's an issue that we deal with every day at the commission, and we grapple with, and something that the legislature has taken up over the last two legislative sessions, and I imagine will give us feedback on again this legislative session.
And so just maybe pausing on this revenue stability, to your point, you looked at 20 to 23, there was enough revenue in total seemingly for someone to have built a plant and made money. But I guess what you're referencing is it would have been lumpy. Like it wouldn't have come smoothly over that period. There would have been periods of poor performance and then spikes of good ones. And so if you're building going forward in the current system, you're sort of depending on spikes to periodically show up to pay the bills.
That's correct. And it's not stable in the sense that, in 2024, up until August, we had a very mild weather year. So 2024, I think when we tally everything, is probably going to show that there wasn't sufficient revenue. And so what, kind of the trade-off when you're in an energy-only market like we are in ERCOT, where we just have two revenue streams, that's, ancillary services and energy, as compared to other markets in the country that have energy ancillaries and a capacity payment component of their revenue. you're going to end up with lower prices in an energy only market. But you're right, you really only see those revenues in times of extreme scarcity. And we've pulled that back a little bit, and we've changed the demand curves in ERCOT so that generators start to realize additional revenues before we get just on the edge of a scarcity event. But it's still not the stability that you would find in a capacity market. But the trade-off in a capacity market is you're paying for more energy than you need most of the year. And so as we're trying to always find Texas-centric solutions, a capacity market and having customers overpay for a good portion of the year is not a solution that we're looking for. We're looking for ways within our current construct to achieve both sufficiency and stability of revenues for generators so that we can keep costs down as well for all customers in the state.
You mentioned the Texas landscape, and one of the features of the Texas landscape is more gas in West Texas than we can possibly use, right? Like I was talking to a friend this morning who was referring to some negative natural gas prices they got in the recent quarter. How does all that excess gas factor into your planning? There's so many other. Texas is pro-business. It's got low cost of power. It's got all these great things. It does have this interesting feature of gas. More gas than we can use, seemingly. How does that factor in?
Yeah, I mean, we want to be able to use all that gas. Obviously flaring gas is not necessarily in anyone's interest. And so it definitely plays in. Like I said at the outset, we are blessed in this state to have a natural gas resource abundance, and we need to figure out ways to use that gas to benefit the citizens and businesses in the state of Texas. And so my hope is as we endeavor to build more gas-fired generation in this state, it'll increase the production of gas in the state, which helps our tax base and helps severance taxes into the state treasury to help fund a myriad of programs statewide. But it can also be used to supply energy and electricity at a reasonable price for Texas, because we should find a way to benefit from all of our abundant natural resources, and figuring out a way to use that abundant gas resource is definitely something that we're always working on with our counterparts at the Railroad Commission and the oil and gas industry to find efficient and effective ways to use that abundant gas that we have in the state.
Chairman Gleeson, I'm going to go back to an earlier point you made about having a generation, behind the gate, and it really is maybe a distributed generation question. But I think about in this recent Meta with Entergy deal in Louisiana, and it almost feels like that is kind of something that you're thinking is maybe a model for what ERCOT should be doing as well. And I think we're starting to see that in other states. Is that kind of what you're thinking? Is that what you're saying? Is that is the ideal deal where 1 + 1 = 3 from a power generation standpoint?
That's right. I think of it kind of in 3 buckets. You have, these large users that can connect in front of the meter. Then you have agreements where a large customer will connect behind the meter with an existing resource. And then third bucket is really customers coming with their own generation, whether they build it or contract with a generator to build it completely off the grid. So I think if a company wants to come to market and get speed to power as quickly as possible, coming with your own generation and staying completely off grid is probably the quickest way to do that. And we're definitely in favor of that. But yeah, that second bucket where you either co-locate, where a customer either co-locates with an existing resource or they co-locate with a new resource, but they are going to be interconnected to the grid, but also help that generator partner with them to build additional generating capacity above what they would do on their own. That really feels like the sweet spot for all of this, because again, these companies have very healthy balance sheets. They have a lot of kind of free cash flow and have to decide what to do. And if they can use up that free cash flow, say, not necessarily just to, buy back stock or issue dividends, but partner with a generator in this state to provide additional electricity, I think that's a really good use for that freed up cash flow, and it benefits everyone in the state. And I think really gives cause for why we try to be such a business friendly state, because we believe that those businesses in turn will come through on the other side and help the state out when it's in need.
Chairman, we see a lot of tension sometimes in the discussion around what type of nuclear states or, customers, potential owners might be considering. And that's kind of weird considering that the discussion around large nuclear was mostly dead just a couple of years ago. We got commissioners in Georgia saying you can't build new nuclear in their state until, after the Vogtle experience, until they get federal cost overrun insurance and additional levers like that, which may seem heavy in some ways to some, and maybe too heavy. So do you see it as a matter of time, a matter of more levers, a matter of a little bit of thumb on the scale in terms of some of these levers, or more of these big heavy lifts needed? And do you see the tension as well in your state between small and existing large in these conversations of building new nuclear?
So I would say I wouldn't characterize it in Texas as a tension. I think there's a level of comfort in this state with all flavors of nuclear. My former colleague, Jimmy Glaufelty, led a nuclear effort here, Advanced Nuclear Working Group, that came out with a report towards the end of 2024 that really focused on small modular reactors. And I think there's a lot of good work being done on that front. That report, which is accessible through the PUC's website at puc.texas.gov, has a lot of really good information in it. Also has roughly 7 recommendations for the state legislature and the governor to consider, which range from, buying down risk, meaning, partnering with private entities to front the upfront capital costs to buy down some of that risk, all the way to providing completion bonuses to try to speed up the timeline for small modular reactors to be built at scale. But I think with the announcement from Constellation and Microsoft in Pennsylvania of the resurrection of 3 Mile Island, that really got people in our state house talking about, well, what is the opportunity to bring on more large-scale nuclear baseload? There are a few sites in Texas that have already gotten permitted that have additional area to build, and whether that's SMRs or micro reactors or large-scale nuclear reactors, I think all of those are on the table and will be, discussions we have with the new administration and the NRC about what are our options. Because, I think everyone cares about the environment and clean air. And really, if you're an environmentalist and care about environmental concerns and you care about reliability, you have to be in favor of nuclear, in my opinion, because if you're not, especially in Texas, given the demand growth, your math is not going to math. There isn't going to be enough other sources of clean energy to meet the growing demand. And it just won't work out on that side. And so I really believe you have to be in favor of nuclear. I think it can be done in a responsible way that protects everyone's interests and ensures that there are no, large scale issues, whether that's with siting or with any type of disaster with that reactor. And so I think it's something we need to start now. A lot of these projects are probably 5 to 7 to 10 and even more years away. But we have to start having those conversations now so we can either, partner with private industry to accelerate the timeline, or at least be ready to act when the private industry brings these to market. And in Texas, I think you've seen leadership from the governor wanting us to be at the forefront of these discussions, and we'll continue having all of those discussions, both at the state and federal level, with the new Trump administration.
So one question, Chairman Gleeson, there used to be these structures, sometimes honestly in developing countries, where they were build, operate, transfer. Like, so the government body would build the infrastructure, operate it for a while, and then it would get transferred to the private sector, or the other way around. The private would do it and then transfer it to the government. It may have more often been the latter. But is there any way for the state to step in directly? This may sound like so unlike Texas. I don't know why I'm asking. to step in directly to fund some of this infrastructure, whether it's a large gas plant or even nuclear, and then transfer it to the public sector somewhere down the road? Is that just a ridiculous idea?
I think there is an opportunity to have those discussions. Last legislative session, the legislature passed and the governor signed Senate Bill 2627, the Texas Energy Fund. And as part of that funding, there's $7.2 billion, $6 billion of which is going to fund to provide low interest loans to generators of mostly natural gas facilities. There have been discussions about either a different funding stream or expanding the use of that fund to include nuclear, because again, right now, other than permitting, the greatest impediment to this is really the upfront capital costs. And so I definitely think there's an opportunity. I don't think you'll ever see in Texas a situation where the state gets involved in owning, operating, and maintaining generation resources in the ERCOT system. I just think there's not an appetite for that. But again, Texas always looks, we are blessed in this state with a budget surplus, which most other states do not have, and the federal government doesn't have. We have some $23 billion estimated surplus in the state heading into this legislative session based on estimates from the comptroller of public accounts for the state. And so, I think state leadership is always looking for ways to partner with private entities to bring all those resources to bear to get positive outcomes for the state. And I think nuclear funding is one of those we'll have. I don't know what flavor that'll look like. I think you'll have a lot of policy ideas that get vetted, presented, and ultimately get vetted through the process. But again, nuclear is, everyone I ever talk to is in favor of nuclear in this state and doing what the government can to partner with those private entities to ensure Texas is at the forefront of that. Is something that I think you'll hear a lot about this session, and I know the P to achieve.
So last question, because thank you so much for your time today and your just collegiality and friendship. It's just been great getting to know you. One thing we always hear about, it came up in Mike's question, is distributed generation. And that can mean a lot of things. Maybe it means something pretty big, that's behind your plant, or maybe it means something pretty small that's behind your house. But do you have a sense of how much distributed generation is just in the state? Like how much is out there? How much will it grow? And is that the way to think of that? Is that a separate system, or is that something that's going to augment the big system? So how should we think about that as a source of power?
Yeah, so I think when done at scale, I would view it as a complement to the bulk power system. Absolutely. We endeavored to start a pilot project at ERCOT. I think by the end of that pilot project, we got, I want to say, roughly 10 megawatts of participation. The cap for that was around 80. So we didn't see full participation, but I also think that's okay. Really what we achieved through that pilot project, and what I think the goal of any pilot project really should be, is we proved up the proof of concept, right? It worked. There were retail electric providers and customers willing to do it. That now moves to the ERCOT process. And so what you'll see through that is finding ways through participation from all stakeholders interested in distributed energy resources on how do we scale this up? Because I think the potential in the state is immense, given the amount of solar panels and power walls in this state, and the ability to kind of island different communities and businesses to where they can take their demand off the grid, and then in times of scarcity, provide power back to the grid and get compensated for it the way that other large customers do, I think is a really big opportunity for this state. I don't think we have a real handle on what the potential is, how much there is out there for full distributed energy resources, but it's something we're looking at and we're working to achieve. Because I think, again, everything, our North Star is how do we ensure reliability with all of the load coming on, and distributed energy resources is going to be a part of that solution. And it's really our job to figure out how to bring all those resources to bear and then bring them to market in a managed way that benefits everyone in the state.
Awesome. Well, Chairman Gleeson, we greatly appreciate it, particularly on a day like today. Your phone's ringing. There's a lot of stuff you're watching. And so you taking some time to talk with us about all these issues is super appreciated. So thank you.
Maynard, Mike, Brent, I definitely appreciate the opportunity to talk to y'all. I appreciate the friendship and the ability to talk through all these different issues. Texas is at the forefront of a lot of this, and appreciate all of Veriton's work as well in helping us come up with solutions. So thanks for the opportunity, and look forward to doing it again sometime.
You are too kind. We will hopefully see you, if not sooner, this summer, as we talked about. So thank you.
Absolutely. Y'all take care.
Thanks, everybody.